I'll just repeat that one more time. So again, welcome. We want to make sure everyone knows where they are. They are at the Emergency Assistance for Non-Public Schools, EANS Program Budget Application Webinar Part 2. The housekeeping before we get started, and I turn things over to Ms. Margaret this morning. Again, if we go through the presentation and you have questions, please type your question into the chat box, but please make sure that you include your name and your email address so that we can ensure if we're not able to answer your question here on the webinar today, that we are able to get back with you and provide you with a response. All right, I think that is it. I will be placing that particular reminder in the chat as we move through today. But without further ado, I'm going to turn things over to Ms. Margaret Roberts, and she will lead you as the facilitator of today's webinar. Thank you.
Thank you very much. All right, guys, we're going to go ahead and get started. As we mentioned, we're here today to discuss the Emergency Assistance for Non-Public Schools, or EANS program. It is the budget application webinar part 2. We're going to go over several things today. Like last time, it's pretty jam-packed, so definitely utilize the chat feature for those questions. We will get back to you via email if we're unable to get to them today. But today we're going to focus on our application phases, final allocation overview. We're going to hit that budget application timeline again so that you're aware how much longer this step of the program is going to be. Kind of a reminder that you want to keep in the back of your mind all these different timelines that we're going to go over. In general, we'll talk about the different program steps, the budget application accessibility and resources, budget application overview. We're going to look at some of the allowable reimbursements and future expenditures. And we're going to look at the reimbursement, procurement, and inventory process. We're also going to go over some common questions, which I think will be really helpful for you guys. We've incorporated a lot of the questions that we've seen come into the info account and come in through our helpline. So if chances are, if somebody's asked this question, you might have this question too. So I think that's going to be a really impactful section. And then we're going to finish up with some next steps and resources. As we go through some of this, I am aware that for some of us, this may not be brand new information, which is good. It's just a reminder if you already participated in our first webinar, but we are utilizing this opportunity to kind of remind you of some of the important things about the program, as well as, again, go over those common questions and provide this information for those who maybe weren't able to attend the first webinar. But the first step here, we're going to look at the application phases and the final allocation overview. So this program has been kind of broken out into 2 separate phases. Eligibility phase was the first step, where schools were asked to complete an eligibility application, and that resulted in a final population of eligible schools and final approved allocation amounts. Where we are today, we are currently right smack dab in the middle of the budget phase, or the budget application phase. Eligible schools can go in, fill out their budget application, where they're going to be requesting reimbursement of allowable expenditures and or procurement of allowable future expenditures. So once again, this budget phase and the budget application should only be filled out by those schools that were deemed eligible through the first phase of the program. So I mention this as an opportunity for anyone who may have hopped on. If your school wasn't deemed eligible through that first phase, then you're not going to be able to fill out that budget application, nor should you. So again, just kind of where we are, what we're talking about today, in the instance this doesn't apply to you and you don't want to hang tight with us. So our final allocation development. So when we were finished with that phase 1, the eligibility phase, and we were able to get our final population of schools, we were able to come up with and adjust those preliminary allocation amounts to come up with final allocation amounts. It's very similar to how the preliminary allocation amounts were determined. We looked at the low income student count data confirmed during the eligibility application phase. And a reminder, that's for the 2019 through 2020 school year, as well as our final population of schools that were deemed eligible for the program. Those are the two kind of pieces of information that dictated what the final allocation amounts were. Those have been approved and communicated to each eligible school via an allocation notice. If you have any questions about that allocation notice or want more information, there is what's called a final allocation spreadsheet, and it's located on the Louisiana Department of Education website. When you look up there, you can see not only that spreadsheet, but you'll see a copy of this presentation where all of these links will be active for you. So that formula methodology for allocation, again, we're looking at you get an allocation for total student enrollment, as well as an allocation for enrolled students that are from low income families. So that's the two components. So that final total enrollment allocation per pupil is roughly $716, with an additional roughly $716 per each student from low income families. So if you were to look at that sort of in its mathematical equation laid out at the bottom here, again, a reminder, 2019 through 2020 school year information is what we're looking at when we determined this final allocation amount. Total student enrollment for 2019 to 2020 times $716, plus total students from low income families times $716 would be the total allocation amount. I mentioned this last time, but just for everyone's awareness, these figures have been rounded to the nearest dollar. So if you log in and see that final allocation spreadsheet and you notice it's slightly off, it could just be due to rounding. Budget application timeline. So this is going to be a really important piece of information here. We just top to bottom, we issued the allocation notices on April 30th. And the budget application has opened. It is open. It's available now to those that are deemed eligible through phase 1. And that opened up on May 3rd, 2021. The bolded date that you see right in the middle, June 1st, 2021 at 11:59 p.m., very specific, is the budget application close. That is a really important one. As I mentioned, we are about halfway through the budget application phase. So keep in mind, we got about 2 weeks left to finish up your budget applications and get them in. Note that budget application deadline is the day after Memorial Day. So again, keep that in mind. Your school might be off probably for Memorial Day. So you want to make sure if you were waiting until the end, which we encourage you to get them in as soon as possible. But if you happen to, just know that right when you get back in, you're going to want to double check that you've submitted it. End of June is our anticipated budget application review completion. That's when we anticipate having all of those budget applications reviewed. And additionally, the program will obligate funds by August 5th, 2021, which you see is listed here as our obligation date. However, for future procurement, the procured items that result from an approved budget application, after we review them, this means that items that are going through the procurement process may be confirmed by this date, but maybe not necessarily delivered in hand by that date, just due to the availability of the goods. Program steps overview. So I like to include this slide because I think it's very helpful to kind of see what you've done thus far and what's coming up in the pipeline of your next steps. So at this point, if you're an eligible school and you're going to fill out a budget application, you already filled out an eligibility application for your school, and you received an eligibility notice following that application. Prior to your webinar, our webinar, you would have received that allocation notice that has your final approved allocation amount. Next, you're going to complete and submit the budget application. Again, that's the topic of today, the hot topic at hand. That's what we're talking about. And once all of those have been submitted, the program's going to review all those application requests, and we're going to issue something that's called a notice of allowable costs. So that's kind of your next notice, official notice that would be coming from the program. And it's going to let you know what your final approved reimbursement amount is. and what allowable future procurement items have been approved. Then the Louisiana Department of Education is going to use your final allocation amount that we've discussed and gone over to fund your approved reimbursements first. And then they're going to work to procure any of those allowable future expenditures with any allocation amount that we have remaining from your final allocation amount. Budget application, accessibility, and resources. So we went over this in the first webinar, but I want to let you know we've got a little bit more detailed information about these resources that we're going to go over in the next few slides. But right off the bat, in terms of accessing that budget application, it is available in the Federal Support and Grantee Relations Library. So that's where you'll see that access the EANS application button. And when you click on it, that's on the home page. It will bring you to the Federal Support and Grantee Relations Library, where you're going to search for or look for the Emergency Assistance to Non-Public Schools program box. That's what you see listed here in the screenshot. And then you're going to want to locate these resources in the red box that say Phase 2. Those are all of your Phase 2 budget application resources. I highly encourage you to review them while you're filling out your budget application, and definitely encourage you to review them before you start filling them out. It'll help you ensure you know exactly what you're doing before you hit that submit button. When you have reviewed them and you feel like you're ready to fill out that budget application and submit it, you can again click on this access the EANS application button, and it will bring you right up to the application. So as promised, we're going to go a little bit more in depth into these resources, because now that we're halfway through, some of you might have started, some of you maybe haven't started your budget application, but these are going to be very valuable resources for you. So we've got our user manual, our example expenses flyer, our frequently asked questions, program application walkthrough, and then we're going to have our EANS program webinar and our EANS budget application supporting spreadsheet. So the webinar that's listed as the 5/3/2021 is the first webinar that we did. And as of this weekend, we actually have the slides from today's webinar included up there for you. The supporting spreadsheet, the last bullet point you see there, the last resource, that is the required spreadsheet for budget application submission if you're requesting reimbursements. So we'll go into that in more detail in a little bit later. So the user manual. So again, I kind of want to review these so you know which ones might be helpful if you're filling it out and you have a question or you get a little confused. The user manual is pretty much a step-by-step guide on how to fill out the application within the portal. So it kind of runs you through, this is a drop down, this is what we're asking for within this box, instructions along with screenshots. They're going to be a really great reference from the technical side of filling out the application. On the right, you can see the screenshot that we have here. This is just one of the beginning steps of the application. We'd ask you to fill in your school name. And so again, it provides you with that detailed information about what it is we're looking for within that specific field of the budget application. So a great resource for you when you're looking at the portal and filling it out. Now, the example expenses flyer, this is one that I think is going to be really valuable for a lot of you who might have questions about, is this item allowed? I want to know if my specific item is allowed. This resource is something we're going to point you to. I do want to point out it's for demonstration purposes, and it doesn't guarantee nor limit the items that can be requested by schools. So just because it's not on that example expenses flyer, remember, this is just examples. It doesn't mean if your item isn't listed on that flyer, it's not allowable. There are several components and factors that make an expense allowable that we're going to go over in a little bit. This is just kind of get your wheels turning and help you understand what is allowed on the program and probably commonly requested. Within that flyer, the items are broken out into two main categories, our reimbursements and our future procurements. And then we further break those two categories down into three other things: what's allowable, what's not allowable, and what's maybe potentially allowable, so long as we have further COVID-related explanations. And you'll see what that means on the next slide. So it is a little wordy. I know there's a lot of screenshots going on here, but I did want to pull it up so you could see what the example expenses flyer looks like. On the first left-hand side, that's kind of the beginning. It talks about what a reimbursement cost needs to meet. What are those requirements for that reimbursement cost? And then it shows you some examples. Again, demonstration purposes, doesn't guarantee or limit what can be requested. These are items that are probably typically being requested and or allowed for reimbursement. Items that are not allowed for reimbursement listed underneath it. We've got our examples of potential items allowed for future expenditures. And one screenshot went over the other because there was a lot of content and I wanted to show you all different sections. But down here is what I mean when we say maybe it's potentially allowed for reimbursement or future expenditure if we have a sufficiently related explanation about how is this related to COVID. A lot of our, example expenses that were given in our guidelines are overarching categories of expenses. So this flyer was an attempt to go beyond categories and go down to the item level while recognizing that some things aren't going to be clearly, definitively outlined in a category. Thus, they could fall under the umbrella of a category, but we need more information about how it is related to COVID in order for the program to say that this would be an allowable reimbursement or allowable future procurement for the purposes of the EANS program. Frequently asked questions. This is a really, really great document because a lot of the questions we've seen come in are very similar to the ones on here. So you have a lot of good information and answers. Again, it is what it sounds like. It's a list of frequently asked questions along with the program responses. There's about 45 or 46, I think, questions listed on there. So really great resource. You can do a quick, Control F on your keyboard and type in the word maybe you're looking for if you don't want to go sift through all of that, but I do encourage you to go check that out. Our program application walkthrough, another really helpful resource. It's a YouTube video. It's linked to the LDOE YouTube account and it's step-by-step instructions along with a visual of filling out the budget application and the required budget application supporting spreadsheet should you be requesting reimbursement. So it's real-time voiceover, talking you through and clicking the button so you can see how it functions. Another really great opportunity for you to review that if you get any sort of questions or hiccups along the way. Applicant Portal, this is just our kind of reminder that this program does have a fast turnaround. We had a webinar 2 weeks ago, and now we're about halfway through the budget application window of time. So I just want to encourage you to be checking your Applicant Portal regularly. I would encourage about every 2 days to check on the status to make sure you're replying to any of your reviewer comments. If your reviewer is asking you to upload any supporting documentation, you can do that within the portal. And as you saw on the past couple of slides, that budget application user manual and walkthrough are going to be good resources if you have any questions about the actual portal itself. Another sort of reminder when it comes to communication is that we're going to be sending communications to the email address that you have on file. So it's going to be very important that you make sure that is an email address that is regularly checked. As we move forward with the EANS program, a lot of these interactions and a lot of the different steps are we're butting up against summer. So a lot of this communication might take place over the summer. So you definitely want to make sure it's an email address for somebody who's going to be regularly checking their email, even into those summer months. If you need to change that for any reason, you can use the email address you see here to provide an updated contact information for any reason that you might need to do that. You can also add a guest access or a guest user. Basically, this individual will have the ability to view the application and upload attachments as needed. That could be useful if you're filling out the budget application for your school. So you're putting in your email address for the contact info, but maybe your principal wants to be kept up to date with what's going on with the application and wants to be able to log in and see. So you could add the principal there by including their email address in the guest email line. Budget application overview. So because we went a little deep dive into the different steps of filling it out last time, we're not going to go into quite as much detail today about the actual click here type of budget application completion. That is also, again, really, really well outlined, detailed, available in the resources that we've mentioned. But from a high level, I wanted to kind of remind you of what those different steps are. You've got part A, which is your applicant information. You've got part B, non-public school reimbursements. C, well, current allocation breakdown, is between part B and part C. And that's just kind of for visual purposes and for informational purposes. It helps you to be able to see what you've requested already in reimbursement and how that will affect how much you have left over for your future procurement. Part C, non-public school request for services or assistance. That's where you're going to be requesting any future procurements. Part D, certifications by non-public schools for the emergency assistance to non-public schools program. And then finally, your attachments, where you would be uploading anything that you would need to support your budget application, including that required spreadsheet if you are requesting reimbursement. And again, just sort of a disclaimer at the bottom with our resources and our phone number and email address should you have questions or need to get in touch with us after this webinar. Now, some reminders and clarifiers that I think are going to be helpful that aren't necessarily, high level budget application, but a little bit more detailed. This is going to be very, very important. So again, when you're entering in future procurement requests, question C2 says, what's the subcategory? And it's just giving you a list of commonly requested items. It's the program saying, under the categories we have, we know or think these things will be requested a lot. However, it doesn't mean, and as you saw from our example expenses flyer, that that's everything that could be requested or everything that you could want. We couldn't possibly list everything that you could ever want under this program. So we included an other in the dropdown. It's kind of farther down in that dropdown for question C2. So I didn't want anyone to miss it. If you need to request anything that's not listed as a subcategory, use that other dropdown. Once you've used the other, we still need to know what it is, something that's more than just the word other, obviously. So you're going to use C5. Future procurement description. That's where we want you to get us the details. Describe what it is you want that wasn't one of those predetermined subcategory, examples. If you are using C5 future procurement description, we ask that you include as much detailed information as needed for each request in order to assist the program in procuring the desired items. So let's say maybe you wanted to request a specific type of software. Well, you can use C5 future procurement description to tell us what the name of that software is, or to let us know the number of licenses that you're going to need. What's the duration of the license? Is it a year? Is it 2 years? Do you really only need one license or do you need 10? That's what we mean in terms of getting us that helpful information so that the program and LDOE really knows exactly what it is you're requesting so they can try to procure that to the best of their ability with the details you've provided. Or let's say you wanted to make sure we knew you needed to request certain cleaning products because your students maybe have allergies to other cleaning products. You can provide that justification or that reason within that future procurement description. You could say, we need to request organic brand X because our students are allergic to Lysol wipes or something to that effect. Any information, it's a free text field. detailed as possible. That's going to help us in our procurement process and make that go more efficiently. The Excel spreadsheet. So as I've mentioned a handful of times, I really want to hit it this point hard. It is mandatory for reimbursement requests, and it gives us that itemized details for each of your reimbursements that you're requesting and the required descriptions. It's also intended to help you organize and communicate your requests by keeping it all together so that before you submit, you can make sure you've entered in everything you want. Again, we encourage you to fill that out before you enter in the totals per category into the application. You'll notice that that spreadsheet does have a tab for reimbursements and future procurements, but again, it's only mandatory for reimbursements. It's optional for future procurements. However, it can be a good resource for you, again, to list out all your future procurements, make sure you're using the priority designations correctly, and that you've included a lot of detail about what it is you're requesting for a future procurement before you go into the portal and fill it out in the application itself. As always, again, we've listed the resources that we think are going to be helpful as you go fill out that spreadsheet. The reimbursement funding is organized by subcategory. So multiple items can be requested under each category. It's a lot of words. It'll make probably a little bit more sense on the next slide. But basically, if you wanted to request gloves, so your school purchased gloves and some disinfectant wipes or something like that, both of those could fall under category 1, supplies to sanitize, disinfect, and clean schools. But you're only going to be entering in the total dollar amount per category and the category within the actual budget application in the portal. So while gloves and disinfectant can be entered in under category 1, you're going to be entering in the summation of those two expenses, if those were the only two you had for category 1, into the actual application for the category. Promise it'll make more sense with the visual on the next slide, but you will need to provide supporting documentation for each line item request within the reimbursement tab of the spreadsheet. Always a good tip, double check the subtotals for each category on your spreadsheet, tie to the category totals on the application. What are we talking about? We're talking about, I'm filling out this spreadsheet. And again, this might look overwhelming with the screenshots, but if you can follow me, this is what this spreadsheet looks like. This screenshot at the top, I've entered in my gloves and my Clorox wipes under category 1, supplies to sanitize, disinfect, and clean schools. I've entered in all the respective information, my receipt, invoice, the amount, how did I pay for it, the vendor, how is it related to COVID, etc. They were each $500 for a total for category 1 of $1,000. I'm not entering in $500 into the budget application. For reimbursement, it's at a category level. So for category 1, supplies to sanitize, disinfect, and clean facilities, I'm entering in $1,000. That's what we're showing you here in these two screenshots. It's per category. I've got 1,000 as a total. I got 1,200 total for category 4. So I'm going to enter in 1,200 for category 4. Now this additional little tiny other screenshot over here on the right, I didn't want to ignore it. It's an important one too. These are two additional columns that are actually in the spreadsheet over here on the right. It was just hard to get it all into one slide for you, but they're called or titled supporting documentation file name and support documentation page number. So one of the questions that we've seen come in a couple times is related to instances where you maybe have one invoice that contains maybe, let's say, your gloves, your Clorox wipes, and your desk dividers, all purchased from the same vendor. You had one invoice. So an invoice contains multiple items being requested. You do not have to upload that invoice every single time for each individual section. If it's easier for you to just upload that invoice once, that's where you can use these last two columns, supporting documentation file name and page, to tell the program which page the information is located on for the desk dividers. Maybe it's, located at the bottom because you uploaded one PDF, or maybe it's just a bunch of items listed on one large invoice. Use those two columns to tell us what the name of the document is. In the instance, it's only uploaded once, and what page the corresponding information for that desk divider is, or that Clorox wipe is. That's going to be very helpful, especially if you upload everything all together. Maybe the invoice is on page 1, but the proof of payment is on page 22 if it's a large document. That's really helpful. You can put that in the support documentation page number. That kind of nicely ties us into the next slide, which is our required documentation for reimbursements. We went over this last time, but I want to provide a little bit of clarifier for a few things here. You'll notice 2 things have been bolded on the left-hand side: receipts and invoices and proof of payment. At a minimum, that's going to be what's required for your reimbursement. If you have purchase orders because they were used, or a purchase requisition if it was used, you can provide that information in support of your request for reimbursement. But at a minimum, you might only have and be able to provide your receipt and invoice and your proof of payment. That's why we bolded those on the left-hand side. When it comes to your proof of payment, acceptable forms of proof of payment can include copies of one of the following. Maybe you paid in a check and you've got a copy of that check front and back. Maybe you've got a credit card statement or a bank statement. Now, one of the things we've been asked is if I provide my credit card statement and you're able to tie the purchase on the credit card statement to my receipt, do I have to give you proof that my credit card statement was actually paid? So did I pay my bill? That's not something we're looking for. We're looking to make sure we can tie via the credit card statement that the item was in fact purchased and it's not still pending essentially, and who paid for it. So in the instance you're able to provide us that credit card statement and a receipt, that would kind of loosely tie up that request for reimbursement. On the right-hand side, you'll see some information about what all the documentation must adhere to. And as a whole, it has to link, agree to, and support the requested reimbursement cost itemization level. It needs to prove the purchase was dated after March 12th, 2020 through March 5th, 2021. That's our reimbursement period. So the purchase itself needs to have occurred in that time frame. It needs to be able to prove payment was dated prior to budget application submission. This is something we sent a clarifying email out to all eligible schools, that in the instance your purchase was made, let's say in February 2021, but you didn't receive the actual invoice and payment actually didn't occur until, let's say, April. So you purchased it in February, you got it before March 5th, so it falls into the reimbursement category of the program, but you didn't actually receive the invoice from the vendor, let's say, until April, and you paid it in April. That's okay. Prove payment dated prior to budget application submission. Proof of payment is a required documentation for reimbursement. So long as you have proof that you paid it before you submit your application, because you're required to upload proof of payment, that will be okay. But the actual service or good has to have been purchased prior in that window. So March 5th, or excuse me, March 12th, 2020 through March 5th, 2021. Provide evidence of payee and be legible. Obviously, we want to be able to see what we're looking at. In the instance, let's say an individual, so maybe a school employee or a related entity purchase an item on behalf of the school, we're going to need some additional information. We just want to make sure that the school has actually gone through the steps to reimburse that individual or related entity, and making sure we have a check front and back, a credit card statement, maybe a payroll check or distribution report, or a bank statement, and then just kind of a disclaimer about PII needing to be redacted other than that person's name. Or maybe we have a reimbursement or expense request voucher, if that's applicable. Again, it's showing us that the school has in fact reimbursed the individual who made that purchase, since we're going to go through the process of now reimbursing the school. And then there's a disclaimer at the bottom in terms of if that proof of payment shows the payees and the name of the applicant's DBA or trade name, we're going to consider the applicant name and the DBA trade name as the same entity. Allowable reimbursements and future expenditures. This is another, we get a lot of questions about this, obviously. Cost requirements. All items that are requested as reimbursements and future procurements must meet the following requirements. These are kind of 4 things that have to be met for all costs. They have to be requested for secular, neutral, and non-ideological costs, be related to the prevention, preparation for, and/or response to COVID-19, be reasonable, necessary, allocable, and allowable, and are prohibited from having been or becoming reimbursed under other federal programs. Something I want to point out is the related to the prevention, preparation for, and/or response to COVID-19. Remember on our example expenses flyer, where we said something could be, maybe fall under one of the larger categories of allowable costs, but you might need to be able to tell us how it's related to COVID. That's a requirement for all reimbursements and future procurements. That detailed information is going to be pivotal when we go into reviewing your applications. So items allowed as reimbursements. I'm not going to necessarily read all of these word for word. You've seen these categories a couple of times now, and we do acknowledge that a lot of you have had questions about what is or what isn't allowed. I think when it comes to reimbursements and future procurements, the first step you should do is review the categories, review the resources, review the example expenses flyer. But remember, we have a tight turnaround. And sometimes when we get emails that just say, is this item allowed? As you can see, based on what we've reviewed, there are a lot of things that have to be checked in order to say something's allowed. Is it an allowed category? Was it in the allowed time frame for reimbursement? Did you provide the right documentation? Did you provide an explanation that it was related to COVID? It's not just a one and done, oh, it meets one requirement, so you're good. So a lot of times it's hard to tell just via an email if a cost is allowed. That's why my response to everyone is going to be, I highly encourage you to review the resources and include it in your budget application, even if you're unsure if it's allowed, because it will be reviewed when we look through the budget application and we're able to look at all the documentation and all the pieces coming together. So if you aren't sure, definitely include it. That's kind of the step here that I want to make sure everyone's aware of. Same goes for items that are allowed as future expenditures. It's our familiar list that you're probably used to seeing. Items that are not specific, that are specifically not allowed for reimbursement nor future expenditure, payroll expenses and vendor expenses to perform cleaning services. So you might have be reimbursed or provided future services for cleaning supplies, but not for a vendor who's performing those cleaning. We've had questions come in that have maybe said, we have a contract with a cleaning service, so could their supplies be reimbursed, but maybe not necessarily the cost to actually pay them? And that is in the federal FAQs, and that is an allowable expense where the supplies could be covered, but not necessarily the actual cost for the cleaning services itself themselves. What does reimbursement means for the EANS program? So your school may receive payment for allowable expenditures. Again, remember, they have to be incurred after March 12th through March 5th, and it has to have been paid prior to your budget application submission. It has to be requested, the requested item has to meet our 4 requirements that you see listed that we've gone over a handful of times: secular, neutral, non-ideological, related to COVID, reasonable, necessary, allocable, and allowable, and can't be reimbursed under another federal program. LDOE will gain title to these materials, equipment, and/or property that's reimbursed with EANS funds. And your school will be responsible for following LDOE's inventory process, including the tracking and reporting of these items. Now, you can use these items through the end of the EANS program, which is September 30th, 2023. But your school will need to work directly with LDOE if you wish to continue using these items beyond this date. Future expenditure, very similar in terms of what it means, other than the two big pieces here. It's for allowable expenses incurred after March 5th. So that's the time here. We're looking at after March 5th, and they're going to have to be procured through the budget application submission and through LDOE's procurement process. We have our same 4 requirements that we've reviewed. Same requirement holds true in terms of LDOE holding title to these materials, equipment, or property. You're still going to have to be responsible for following LDOE's procurement and inventory process, and you can still use these items through the end of the EANS program. We'll touch on that in the next slide because I know we've had a lot of questions about that. So what do we keep saying? What do we mean when we keep saying end of the EANS program? So equipment and supplies that are purchased through EANS funding, again, hit our basis, make sure we're all aware, they can be used through the end of the program. Through this program, at the end of this program, September 30th, 2023, or until no longer needed for the purposes of the program. So once the equipment or non-consumed supplies are no longer needed, or by September 30th, LDOE must remove these items from the schools. They have to remove the items from the schools as soon as they're no longer needed, or by September 30th, 2023. If your school still requires those items after September 30th, you may be able to keep using them, but you would have to provide a justification to LDOE indicating that the goods and services are still needed for other allowable purposes under another federal education program, such as the ESEA or the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. And in that case, LDOE is still going to retain title to and maintain that administrative control over those items, the equipment and supplies, or they might transfer title and control to the other public agency, such as an LEA, who is providing those equitable services under another federal education program. So we've received a lot of questions about that. It's not that your school just gets to keep the items should you explain that they're still in need at that time. These items do have to be removed at September 30th, 2023. But if you still need them for the purposes of another federal education program, you might be able to work with LDOE at that time in order to go through that process. Reimbursement, procurement, and inventory process. So if an allowable reimbursement expense does not have all the required documentation, then yes, the program will not provide reimbursement for that expense. There are required documentation for a reason. If we do not have everything we need, we cannot provide reimbursement for that individual item. However, that's just for that one item. We would keep moving down the list of reimbursements and potentially provide you reimbursement for the other requests where you do have all the supporting documentation. If a school is approved for reimbursement, the school's funds will be received in accordance with that school's current vendor setup within the LDOE accounting system, LA.gov. If your school needs to be set up as a vendor within LA.gov, you can go to the Office of Statewide Reporting and Accounting Policy, and detailed instructions are available under the Office of State Procurement, LA.gov New Vendor Registration section. This is a hyperlink. That is why it is that color. So after this, if you want to go look at the PDF version of these slides that are available on the website, you can click that and it'll bring you directly to the PDF with step-by-step instructions on how to set yourself up as a vendor. We've also received a lot of questions from schools saying they want to know if someone that they would like to provide a service can become a state vendor. So we've seen several of those questions come in. The response to you is going to be what we're going to go over here, which is any service provider, including a school, can use the information found in those detailed instructions for reference on setting themselves up as a vendor in LA.gov. So all of those, the resources are going to be there for you, including some answers to your typical questions and instructions on how to set it up. So if you have a service provider who potentially wants to become a vendor with the state of Louisiana for this program, we can direct them in that to that PDF, to those detailed instructions available for you. procurement process. So the program cannot guarantee that all items requested for future expenditure will be provided, but they're going to be looked at and reviewed in the following order. We're going to start off with your priority 1. So that's why the priority designations for future procurement are so important. Then we're going to look at item number 1 that you said is the most important thing, and we're going to check to see if it's allowed. We're going to then check to see if it is allowed, is there remaining final allocation amount after your school's reimbursement requests have been fulfilled? Is that sufficient to cover the cost? And then we're going to use available, approved, and contracted LDOE vendors. Again, I'm going to refer everybody to that first slide or that last slide. If you have questions about someone becoming a vendor, you can give them those resources that we've linked. LDOE is going to use those priority designations to begin assessing approved procurement. So it's very, very important that you're using the priority designations in accordance with what your school needs. Make sure priority is 1 is what you want the most. At this time, a list of EANS vendors is not available, and we also don't technically have a full list of goods and services that are available for review. However, I encourage you to go check out the example expenses flyer for, again, that list of potential items that are allowable for reimbursement and future expenditure only for demonstration purposes. Remember, it doesn't limit what you can request. We have that other drop down for a reason. We were giving you some suggestions of commonly requested items, but definitely use that other drop down and the C5 future procurement description to give us all that really good detailed info that we're going to need in order to procure your requested item if it's allowed. And then as always, we're going to procure those based on available, approved, and contracted vendors. Oop, I skipped one really quickly. I got excited. The inventory process. So another kind of common question that's come up a few times. Each school will designate a point of contact for the inventory handling of reimbursed items and future expenditure items where LDOE will be gaining title to the materials, equipment, or property. We shared some information in the previous webinar about the really specifics about how that process will work. It got a little nitty gritty and very detailed, and you can go look at the previous webinar slides if you want to see that information. But I really just wanted to reiterate that that information was provided to help your school in determining what you want to request within your budget application. However, more information regarding that inventory process and what exactly it looks like for reimbursement, other than knowing that you're going to be reimbursed, how your school is set up within LA Gov, the accounting system, or how that future procurement conversation is going to go. We'll have some more detailed information about that after the budget application process is complete. Right now, we really just want to encourage you to fill out that budget application, get it submitted, and make sure you're filling it out with everything you want, as detailed as you want, while knowing that we're not going to be able to go back and add more things later on. So just keep that in mind. Make sure you're making it detailed and fully comprehensive of everything you want. Now I'm going to go into your common questions. So some of you have asked about logging back into your application. Maybe you haven't logged back in since you filled out the eligibility application, or how to log in to respond to a reviewer or upload a requested document. Again, I'm going to point you in the direction of that phase 2 EANS budget application user manual, very detailed step-by-step information in that document. Or you can always, we have our hotline number listed, or the info account. I know we've got probably some good questions coming into the chat feature. As we said, make sure you're including your email address with those questions, because we'll be replying to you using that info at LDOE-EANS account. So that's going to be imperative that you got that email address listed so we can get back in touch with you to make sure we've addressed your question. Where can I access the budget application? It is available online at the Federal Support and Grantee Relations Library on LDOE's website. Remember that slide earlier in the presentation where we showed you the big round circular buttons and we had the list of the resource materials? Those are all up there for you. Another quick reminder, probably tired of hearing me say it, but those resource materials all will have that phase 2 designation up there. Some of the other resources from phase 1 are still there should you want or need to see them, but all of the information for the budget application, so all these helpful documents we've talked about today that you're going to go look at while you're filling out your budget application, those will all have phase 2 listed like you see here. That's how you know you're looking at the right stuff. Can I edit my budget application after submission? So you've hit submit. Can you go in and switch the amounts that you're requesting for reimbursement? Switch the categories between reimbursement and future expenditure? Or can you go in and say, oh, I actually want to add another, item. I thought of another thing that I want for reimbursement or for future procurement. The short and sweet answer is no. And that's why it is very important, amongst everything else that I've said is very important, to make sure you are submitting all costs that your school wants to submit for both reimbursement and future expenditure before you submit your budget application. You can, when you're filling it out, hit save draft and exit. That just saves a draft. That does allow you to come back in later and tweak it, edit it before you submit. But when you hit the final submit button, that's it. That's what you're requesting. So I encourage you to make sure you've got every single thing you could ever want included before you hit that button. That's also why that spreadsheet, the required spreadsheet for reimbursement, but optional if you're just requesting future, is really helpful. It helps you get, pen to paper in one concise document, everything you want, so you can make sure it's all there before you're going into the portal and you're looking at different buttons and maybe it's a little confusing. So the spreadsheet's really helpful in keeping you organized and make sure you got everything there. How do the priority requests work? Again, I've kind of said my favorite phrase is this is important, but it is in order to make sure that we're addressing your school priorities and we're maximizing the impact that your budget has. We ask you to assign a level of priority to each item being requested for future procurement. Priority 1, number 1, that's the highest. All reimbursement requests are deemed a higher priority to that budgeted allocation than future procurement requests. So basically, if you have $100,000 for final allocation and you're submitting $20,000 for reimbursement, that means you've got about $80,000 for future procurement. And we're going to use your final allocation to fund that reimbursement for all the allowable reimbursements before we look at what's left over to procure your future procurements. If I cannot find enough documentation to support a reimbursement, will it be denied and my other items still reviewed? Absolutely. Every reimbursement item is looked at an individual level. If you maybe don't have proof of payment for one item, we just won't reimburse that one item and we would move on to the next item and look at its documentation. Then we're gonna, once we've looked at all your reimbursements, that's when we move on to future procurements, and we're going to go through your future procurements, starting with priority 1 until we reach your total allocation amount or until we get to all of your future procurement requests. I know that's one of the questions that's come in, and it's actually addressed on a future slide, but I'll say it again, or I'll say it twice. You can request as much as you want for your future procurement for allowable items, and we'll work through it until we've addressed them all or until we reach your final allocation amount. If any requests get denied or if there is leftover funding, what happens to it? So unobligated funds do revert back to the governor for authorized use under that GER2 fund. That's a question I think we've had come in a few times. Is a nurse or school counselor an allowable future procurement expense? So the potential for a contracted nurse, counselor, or teacher for services related to COVID-19 activities is typically applicable for future procurements. But I do want to note that while these are potentially allowable expenses, in order for it to be included as part of the EANS program, it would be procured through LDOE, meaning LDOE would contract directly with the vendor to provide the service. So you can request this again within your future expenditure section of the application, and a final determination would be made when your budget application is reviewed. Are capital improvements an allowable expense? So remember, The answer is no, but remember, LDOE is going to hold title to all the items being reimbursed or procured through this program. And as we've mentioned, once that equipment or non-consumed supplies are no longer needed, or by September 30th, LDOE must be able to remove these items from the school. I also wanted to say that because there's an additional requirement when we talk about being able to remove these items from the school, that the equipment and supplies purchased through the EANS funds must be able to be removed from a non-public school without remodeling the non-public school facility. So capital improvements do not meet that requirement. Will the program pay for installation of software and or training for staff on how to use requested software? If your school requires training on how to use a requested software, you should enter in a separate budget application item for that training expense. So if you're requesting future procurement and it's a brand new software that your school has never used and you'd like your teachers to be trained on it, include that, use the other drop down that we've talked about, use the future procurement description box to describe what you need. That would need to be entered in as a separate request. Additionally, typically, the software purchased comes separate from a device with specific license keys. So LDOE's Office of Technology Services can maintain those keys in a database or via the software's management portal. But I think the real meatier question here that y'all are asking is your school will need to use your technology staff in order to install and maintain that software that's being provided. Is supporting documentation required for future procurements? So no, there's technically no supporting documentation required for future procurement requests. However, again, I encourage you to use C5 future procurement description to enter in any descriptive and detailed information that could be helpful when procuring this desired item. Again, software is my kind of go-to example, but tell us the name, the number of licenses, and the duration of the license. Also, we've been receiving several questions about whether or not quotes are required to be submitted for future procurement requests. The answer is no. Again, it's not required, but while it's not required, again, we do encourage you as much information as you can give us about your future procurement in order for the program to efficiently procure the item is great. And again, just a reminder, they're going to be procured by using LDOE available, approved, and contracted vendors. If the item I want to request is not specifically listed, as an example of an allowable reimbursement or future procurement, how do I find out if it's allowable or if I should include it within my budget application? I'm going to encourage you every time, submit it in your budget application along with all other items that you desire, and it will be reviewed when you submit your budget application. All the information we've provided you is to give you an idea of what's allowed, give you some examples, doesn't limit what you can request. And oftentimes we're going to need more information than just the name of what it is in order for us to really determine if it's going to be included. So it's best for you to include it in your application if you want it. Should my school request more items than we think our allocation will cover in case a requested item gets denied? We're going to look at everything until you reach your total allocation amount. So there is no harm in you submitting additional requests for future procurement in order to ensure you reach your final allocation amount. When requesting future expenditures, can I enter more than 20 items? Right now, future expenditures only really allows 20 items, but if you have more than 20 items being requested, just reach out to us and we'll help you get that figured out. And our program guarantee I will have my future procurement request in hand by August 5th. We're going to review all budget applications as they're received. We're not going to be able to really give you a time frame around an exact date in which you'll have those goods in hand. But remember, we're going to obligate funds by August 5th, 2021, but that doesn't necessarily guarantee delivery of future procurement items by August 5th, as items may be delivered after this date due to availability. I'm going to try to get through these next couple slides. We only got a few more, guys. I think this might be our last one. Can my school purchase the items paid for and or provided by DOE in order to retain them after September 30th? No, we cannot. LDOE, the program, cannot sell or transfer any items to your school. Remember, they have to be used for the purposes of the program through the end of the program or until no longer needed. At that time, they must be able to be removed from the school without remodeling the facility And if you still require them come September 30th, you might be able to work with LDOE in order to provide a justification showing that your goods or services are still needed for another allowable purpose under another federal program. LDOE will still maintain title of those goods, or they could transfer them to that other agency providing the equitable services, but we cannot sell or transfer, to answer the overarching question that's being asked here. Oh, I promised you that might have been our last one. Next steps and resources. Again, please complete your phase 2 budget application. The deadline is in 2 weeks, so get it in as soon as possible. Tuesday, June 1st, 11:59 p.m., day after Memorial Day. So make sure if you're coming in after the holiday, you've got everything you need to get it in that day. And again, as always, if you have any further questions that we did not address today or that are not addressed in those resources that you've got available to you online, we've got our phone number and our email address listed here. I went 1 minute over, I apologize, but I want to thank you all very, very much for attending today. Hopefully we went over some good stuff for you and helped answer some of those questions that we've seen come in. They've been great questions thus far, so thank you guys so much.
Thank you, Margaret. We appreciate you taking time to facilitate the webinar this morning. I'm sure you guys will be able to go back, review the chat, and then respond to those questions that may not have been answered today. So we thank you for that. As this is the last slide, I just want to encourage all of the all of the non-publics to make sure that they are working to get their budgets in the best posture possible for submission. As Margaret mentioned, if there are things, just include everything you could potentially want. Remember, those areas of allowability are broad. And so wanting to drill down to specifics requires sometimes a conversation to understand the use of what you're going to do with the items, because again, you have to look at and meet those pillars of allowability that were discussed as well. So as you're putting your budgets, I would say, include everything you could want in the event that some things are potentially deemed unallowable. Thank you again, Margaret. We appreciate it. Here again is the phone number to reach out and the email address to reach out, and they will be following up with you with answers to your questions. Thank you all and have a great day.